One Piece is one of the grandest and most ambitious stories of our time. A tale so massive that it has spanned over 1,000 chapters, building its own rich world and history. But it's specifically thanks to its enormous size that its author, Eiichiro Oda, has managed to keep the answers to the biggest mysteries in the series hidden in plain sight. The clues to find the answers to these mysteries have all been there for us to find all these years, but because of the sheer length of the series, it's hard to nail down just exactly where all those instances of foreshadowing took place. So in this occasion, for the penultimate episode about our long series about the identity of the One Piece, I would like to do something different, something special. To take a look back at the entire series so far, and to analyze its most important scenes in order to see how Oda foreshadowed so many elements right under our eyes, and most importantly, to understand how the series will end. However, I should also mention that this is mostly a summary of sorts of many of the points we've made so far across all episodes of this project, so if you find this episode too long and are too pressed for time, it isn't fully necessary to understand the final episode. But if you do have time, I would heavily encourage watching it, as it will serve as a nostalgic road trip across the series and help you gain a better understanding of this wonderful story. So let us go back to where it all began and make our way through the grand laugh tale that is Eiichiro Oda's One Piece. So for this occasion, I like to talk not about a main topic, but rather about the life of a person, to truly understand why they would become the new Joy Boy by taking a look at their adventures. But who exactly is this person? Who is this person who will become the new Joy Boy? Well, the answer is simple, because Roger himself asked that very question. Who is it that will find the One Piece? That'll be my son, of course. Because Roger believed the new Joy Boy would be his son, Portgas D. Ace. Now, hold on, bear with me, I know this sounds weird, but this will all make sense eventually, so just trust me on this and keep watching. For now, let's focus on the story of Portgas D. Ace. Portgas D. Ace was born as the child of the part king Goldie Roger, who during his very last year of life ensured that he would have a kid. Roger then gave himself in and was executed, with the government thinking this would help scare everyone away from attempting to do the same thing. But Roger, laughing in their faces, only kindled a fire in people's hearts, passing on his dream and encouraging them to chase after the One Piece. The reason Roger did this is because he knew that if someone was to inherit Joy Boy's dream, his own dream, they would have to let the entire world hear about it. After all, the chances for someone to actually accomplish this dream would not be easy, so the more people that were drawn to it, the higher the chance that someone would actually find this treasure and bring forth the dawn. With faith that his dream would be inherited and that he would not be forgotten, Roger passed away with a laugh and a smile on his face. And just like he told Rayleigh, he would not die. After his execution, the government did everything to attempt to wipe out Roger's kid, since they feared his bloodline could end up carrying out his ambition in his place. However, Roger's lover, Portgas D. Rouge, managed to hide her kid from the eye of the Marines and ensure that he would be born, even if it cost her her life. As a member of the D-Clan, she put everything on the line to ensure that he would be born. And similarly, another member of the D-Clan, a former rival of Roger, Monkey D. Garp, would adopt and take care of Ace, unable to bring himself to make this child pay for the sins of his father. Ace grew up under the tutelage of Garp, his foster mother Dadan, and alongside two brothers. But across this time, Ace suffered from an existential crisis. Roger was widely hated by the world. Perhaps this was simply as a result of jealousy, or perhaps the world government had spread false rumors in an attempt to dissuade people from following his example. But regardless, there were many who hated Roger, and as such, would hate any child of his. Ace took this personally, believing that he was the son of a demon, and wondering if he really had any worth to be alive. He wanted to prove to himself that his life had meaning, and wanted to set out to sea to make a name for himself. He did not care about the One Piece or anything his father had accomplished, he simply cared about giving his life meaning. And so, Ace set out and embarked on many adventures. He got stranded on an island, made a best friend, and ate a devil fruit. He gathered a big crew, made friends with all types of people, including marines and people from different races, and started to really enjoy his life, making a big name for himself. But eventually Ace would be landing on the shores of a certain Wano country, and it is there he would meet a little girl by the name of Otama. Otama and the other villagers were starved, brought almost to death because of the oppression of the Emperor Kaido, and so Ace made a promise with Otama and set out to defeat Kaido to free the Wano country. Unknowingly, Ace would be inheriting Oden's will to open the borders of the Wano country, which Oden claimed only this new Joy Boy leading this new generation could accomplish. However, as fate would have it, Kaido was simply not present at the moment. Perhaps his true role in this grander story had not been played yet. But instead of Kaido, Ace met Yamato. And Ace formed a bond with Yamato, who also wanted to be free from Kaido. The two exchanged rings under the moonlight and talked about the new generation of pirates Yamato had heard about in Oden's logbook, with Ace declaring that he was certainly in a class of his own, but that the one who would lead this generation would be his little brother. And in doing so, he let out the secret that his little brother had once told him, something that made Yamato realize something very special. Regardless, Yamato and Ace parted ways, but Ace promised Yamato, just like he promised Otama, that he would one day come back and defeat Kaido to free the Wano country and free the two of them in turn. Ace would continue making his way through the new world, but would eventually come head to head against his most fearsome rival yet, the Yonko Whitebeard. And for the first time, Ace experienced bitter defeat. However, Ace eventually came to appreciate living under Whitebeard, seeing him as the father he never had, and would come to forge a close bond with all the members of his crew, his new family. But all would come to a bloody end when one of his own crewmates killed one of his best friends in the crew. When Marshal D. Teach assassinated 4th Divisional leader Thatch. Thatch had gotten his hands on the one devil fruit that Teach had been looking after this whole time, and like Teach said, Thatch ended eating the fruit. And because Thatch had eaten the fruit, Teach had no other choice. He had to kill Thatch to have the fruit be reborn. However, this enraged Ace, leading him to search after Teach. He would search long and far from him, across many islands, but in the end, at last, Ace was finally able to locate Teach on Banaro Island. Ace attempted to avenge Thatch, engaging in a duel against Teach of historical proportions. As Augur put it, this was a crossroads of fate, an encounter between 2D members of opposing ideals, one representing the sun and the other representing the darkness. But ultimately the one who won was darkness. Ace was not able to free the Wano country. Ace was not able to defeat Teach and his darkness. In a sense, Ace was never able to bring the dawn. But in the first place, Ace never cared about that to begin with. Ace was not even interested in the One Piece. Ace didn't seem to care much about bringing the dawn, so can we really say that Ace's dream was the same as Joy Boy's? Well, technically, yes, but that does not mean that Ace himself was the new Joy Boy. So who really is the new Joy Boy? Well, Ace himself said it, didn't he? When Yamato asked about who would be the most prominent member of this new generation, Ace claimed that he was certainly in a class of his own himself, but the one who would lead this new generation, or in other words, the one who would lead the world to its dawn, would be his little brother. Monkey D. Luffy was born and raised in a certain place in the east, at a place called Dawn Island. And what is perhaps the most defining trait of Luffy's early childhood is his fascination with Goldie Roger and pirates in general. We don't see this in the actual story, but the Virakar databook mentioned that Luffy always had a passion for pirates in general, and it's this passion, according to said Virakars, that led Luffy to take an interest in a certain pirate who landed in his town, Shanks. It's with this encounter that Luffy witnessed what real pirates were like, and more than anything else, he saw the Red Heart Pirates partying, singing, dancing, drinking, and having a joyous time together. This fascinated Luffy, hearing them talk about the joys of life, of being a pirate, being free, being able to party with your friends and just having a merry old time. Luffy became enamored with this idea and wanted to be a part of it, so he asked Shanks to let him join his crew. Shanks told his crewmates not to put any weird ideas in Luffy as he was still a kid, since Shanks had been a pirate as a kid himself and he understood the dangers of setting out to sea that early, so he wanted Luffy to properly understand what he was getting into. However, Luffy would say something to Shanks that would leave the pirate completely speechless. "Hey Shanks, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna throw the biggest party in the world." Shanks was shocked because he once heard these very same words from his captain, Goldie Roger. Keep in mind, this is not something that we see directly in the manga, but it is mentioned later on. According to Rayleigh, Shanks once told him that Luffy ended up saying the exact same words that Roger once uttered. Roger had said the exact same thing to Whitebeard and Odin, like Yamato said, that he wanted to throw the biggest party in the world. But ultimately, Roger was not able to fulfill that dream because he realized he was too early for the One Piece. Perhaps this is why Shanks cried to Roger after he returned from Laugh Tale, because Roger confirmed that he wouldn't be able to carry out this dream himself, but could only pass the torch to a new generation so that someone else would be able to do so in his stead and inherit his dream. Shanks really wanted to see that party happen, so he was heartbroken. Perhaps this is exactly what Shanks meant when he said that Luffy reminds him of his younger self. And it's precisely because of this that Shanks found an interest in Luffy. He felt that he could be the one that Roger was waiting for all this time. He bet his arm for the sake of Luffy's growth, and when Luffy declared that he would make many friends and gather an unbeatable crew, find the greatest treasure in the world, and become the Pirate King, at that moment Shanks knew. He understood that someone had properly inherited Roger's dream, and so gifted him his hat. The hat that Roger once wore, he passed it down to someone he believed in. Not because he was certain that he was the chosen one or anything like that, but because he had faith that Luffy had the potential to carry out his dream. Shanks bet on Luffy, a bet on the new era. But before he would one day set out to sea, Luffy came to meet someone who deeply influenced his life. Ace, someone who Luffy wanted to befriend at all costs. And this is because of a very simple reason. Because Luffy had always been alone. Sure, he had the villagers, Makino and even Shanks, but Luffy never made any friends of his age in his life. He was completely alone in that regard, especially at Mount Corvo with bandits he hated being with. To him, being alone was worse than being hurt. After witnessing all those parties and the joy of sharing life with others, Luffy understood very well that life isn't meant to be lived alone. Luffy understood very well that friends are the most important thing of all, which is why to him parties are so important, because they're the best way to share life with others. And finally, one day, Ace and his other friend Sabo would acknowledge Luffy's desire to not be alone and agreed to become his friends. The three of them would grow close over time, and at one point, they decided to declare their own dreams to each other. Sabo wanted to be free from his life as a noble and to set out to sea to achieve true freedom. Ace wanted to give his life meaning and purpose by making a name for himself. But Luffy wished for something completely different. Just like he had proclaimed to Shanks, Luffy proclaimed his ultimate goal: to throw the biggest party in the world. Ace and Sabo were confused by this, but Luffy laughed. They all laughed together, and so Ace decided to lay the first step towards Luffy's dream.
お前ら知ってるか？杯を交わすと兄弟になれるんだ。兄弟？本当かよ！俺たちの絆は兄弟としてつなぐ。
He stole a bottle of sake from the Dan and shared it among the three of them to be tied in a bond of brotherhood, of friendship, just like one would exchange sake at a party. And so, also that Luffy would one day be able to exchange sake with all types of people from all over the world in a massive party, Ace led that first step by exchanging sake between the three of them. These three brothers would continue to be fast friends, giving Luffy his first taste of friendship. Eventually, Sabo would be separated from them, believed to be dead. Luffy was heartbroken, but Ace reassured him one thing: I will not die. Time passed, and so Ace left on his journey. Then some years later, Luffy, now aged 17, finally set out to sea to begin his grand adventure and to start his road towards becoming Pirate King. The journey, however, would not be easy. He met a young man by the name of Kobe and inspired him to chase his own dreams as well, telling him that he was willing to smile and laugh in the face of death. And with that, Luffy finally started to make friends. He first met a swordsman by the name of Zoro with a similar ambition to become the world's strongest swordsman. He met a sly thief by the name of Nami who also had a love for the sea and freedom. A lying marksman by the name of Usopp who also desired to become a brave warrior of the sea. And a gallant cook with a dream to find the All Blue, the sea of legend that would one day be brought by the dawn. Luffy had managed to attain a cook, something he had always wished for alongside attaining a musician, because after all, what is a party without a cook to make food, and a musician to play some music? With all these friendships, Luffy forged bond with these people, exchanging sake with them after they joined his crew just like he did with Ace and Sabo, to form an eternal bond of friendship with them. Finally, Luffy was not alone anymore. These journeys through the waters of the East Blue became Luffy's first steps, but they showed his spirit in his willingness to bring joy to others and connect with his friends. Luffy would free town after town from oppression, bringing freedom wherever he went, culminating in the defeat of Arlong, the crime lord who had taken grasp of the East Blue, going strictly against the dreams of his former captain, deciding not to inherit his will, and giving in to his fear. Luffy helped do what Fisher, Tiger, and Jinbe couldn't, and put an end to Arlong's rule over humans. However, the reason why Luffy took down someone like Arlong wasn't for the sake of justice, but for the sake of his friend. Nami, who had been so emotionally and spiritually tortured by Arlong, free to travel anywhere but chained by the people Arlong held hostage, also wanted to be free, just like Luffy, but the chains that bound her didn't let her be so. And so Luffy gave her freedom in the only way he knew how to, by taking his treasure, the one Shanks had passed on to him, and using it to console Nami, to tell her that his real treasure were his crewmates. Luffy defeated Arlong and freed Nami, in turn inheriting Bellemer's will, and celebrated a massive party alongside Nami and everyone else, the first proper large party Luffy had been able to throw with his friends. With this, Luffy made way for the Grand Line, with one last stop at Lockdown before entering the uproarious sea. There he would almost lose his life, yet in spite of that, he still laughed. And he was able to connect with someone who would be able to save his life, allowing him to finally enter the Grand Line. Entering the Grand Line, this is where Luffy's adventures would truly begin. He made a promise with a whale that had not been able to reunite with his crew, with his caretaker, a former crew member of Roger, wondering if Luffy would be the one Roger had been waiting for. Then he later met a princess by the name of Vivi who wanted to save her kingdom. From that point onwards, Luffy would make a bond with two giants, who despite being from a different race, Luffy didn't see as monsters, but as people as him. Then he later met a reindeer that spoke like a human, also acknowledged him as a person and not as a monster. Together with him, he helped him accomplish the dream of his late father, to let Sakura bloom on his home island, making a miracle come true. Which is why he passed away with a smile on his face, knowing that his will would be inherited and that he would not be forgotten, with Chopper in turn also inheriting the dream of becoming a doctor capable of curing anything. The Straw Hats would then make their way to the kingdom of Alabasta. There Luffy would meet Ace again, and Ace noticed something: that Luffy had made such good friends. And it's upon seeing these friends of Luffy that he became relieved, because he saw that Luffy finally found people he could really trust in. And so Ace bid him goodbye by simply telling him, "The next time we meet will be at the pinnacle of the pirate world." Luffy would then fight hard to help Vivi, and Karl, let's not forget about Best Boy, to free her country, which was falling into the clutches of an evil tyrant. But for as hard as he tried, Luffy eventually experienced defeat for the first time. Luffy had realized that he could not get by through with brute force alone, but that was fine. Luffy lost, Luffy was defeated, but he got back up again, learned from his defeat, and rose up to the challenge once more. And he lost again, but he got back up again. And that, at its core, might be Luffy's biggest strength, that he is always willing to suffer defeat. Most would find that to be a wound to their pride, but to Luffy, it doesn't matter, because as long as he could eventually succeed, as long as he could protect his friends, he didn't care if his pride was tarnished. He took every loss and used it to learn, to improve, and to become better, because no matter how many times he's pounded, defeated, or tossed away, Luffy will always bounce back, because he's made of rubber. And so, after a difficult struggle, Luffy would come out on top, and help free this country from the darkness that lurked beneath it, bringing freedom to all its inhabitants. An ally of his sadly had to put down his life to save everybody, but even then, right before his death, he smiled. And let's definitely pretend that's where it ended and that Oda totally didn't feel bad and retconned one of the best death scenes in the entire series. Yep, nothing more happened. Moving on. Luffy celebrated this victory by partying with his friends among uproarious laughter. Finally, it came time to move on to yet another adventure, but unfortunately one of Luffy's friends would have to stay behind. The two of them parted ways, but even so, they knew that the bond of friendship that they had exchanged together would remain forever. However, a new friend would join Luffy, a woman by the name of Nico Robin, an archaeologist from Hara who had an interest in the true history. Together with her, Luffy and his friends became fascinated with the idea of an island in the sky. In their attempt to make their way there, they came upon the island of Jaya, where Luffy and the others were ridiculed and laughed at for attempting to chase after such delusional dreams. And yet, there was a person who did encourage Luffy. This was someone whom Luffy disagreed on an existential level. The pies he found so delicious, Luffy hated, and the drinks Luffy found so delectable, he hated in turn. They were the complete opposites of each other in every possible way, yet in the same sense they were both two sides of the same coin. Two opposite fates that wished to take the world in different directions. They represented different ideals, but they were following the same path to the pinnacle. Meaning that one day they would have to clash. Which is why that man encouraged Luffy to reach for the pinnacle and told him a simple thing. And with that, he bid him goodbye, neither knowing but both understanding that they would one day face each other for their struggle to attain the One Piece. Luffy and his friends then made their way to Skypiea and came into contact with the long ward that had been traveling the sky for so long. I've already talked in long depth about the story of the sky, so I won't repeat myself much here, but ultimately, through his efforts, Luffy was able to put an end to that conflict. He inherited Kalgara and Nolan's will to ring the bell and deliver that message, and brought an end to a 400-year-long war through the simple act of throwing a party. The people of the sky who had desired to return to an utopia where they could all live together in harmony finally managed to do so once again, not by going to some holy promised land, but by learning to live alongside each other. Luffy was able to unite these different races and bring them joy through a simple party. Luffy and his friends left the islands of the sky to head for their next destination. They faced a dangerous foe, making Luffy realize he needed to get stronger. Then they made their way to an island of shipwrights, being told that their ship was beyond repair. They struggled to say goodbye to it, but eventually finally accepted that it was fine to move on. However, one of Luffy's friends wouldn't accept that. He struggled to move on, he wouldn't accept Mary's death, leading to his departure from the crew. Another one of his crew members mysteriously vanished, claiming to be done with them as well, and among other problems, it truly felt like Luffy's crew was falling apart. But Luffy believed in the bonds he had formed with his friends, and he pushed himself to the absolute limit to make sure that he'd be able to bring all of them back. Luffy chased after Robin all the way to Enies Lobby simply because she was his friend. What Sol had told her so long ago that she would one day find friends who would truly love her was finally coming to pass. Sol's will was a simple one, for Robin to find friends, and so in that regard he passed away with a smile on his face as he laughed, because he knew that his will would be inherited, and that one day someone would come after Robin to make sure that she would never have to be alone. In face of this, Frankie burned the blueprints of Pluton, having faith that the Straw Hats would know how to stop the weapons from being used for evil intent, using them for the greater good. Luffy and Robin fought to the bitter end to escape, but alas found themselves in an inescapable situation. Despite Luffy getting up again, bouncing back and coming out victorious, their fates were sealed. And yet, Mary came back for them. Their friend came back to save them and allowed them to get away. This was its last effort, as the ship could not bear to sail any longer. This last sacrifice to save them was her last action, but she still did so because she wanted to take them as far as she could. But that was fine, because for as much as she wished to sail with them for a bit longer, Mary knew that she would not die, because her will was to take the Straw Hats to the end of the world. She knew she would not be forgotten, and that her will to carry the Straw Hats all the way to the end of the journey would be inherited by both the Straw Hats themselves and by their new ship. And so, as Mary was burned down and everyone gave their goodbyes, Mary passed away with a smile on her face. So, together with a new ship, inheriting Mary's will, his old crewmate back, and new crew members to boot, Luffy threw a party once more with all the people he had managed to make ties with across this past adventure. And after exchanging sake with his new crewmates, Luffy left for a new adventure. The Straw Hats would end up stranded on the ghost island of Thriller Bark. Luffy gained what is potentially one of his most important additions, finally getting the musician he wished to gather to be able to throw this incredible party. This musician, in turn, was someone who was inheriting the will of his former crew, who wanted to play their song one last time for Laboon. It is because that they all knew that their dream would be achieved that they all passed away smiling and laughing, knowing that their will would be inherited, both by Brook and by Luffy, who would lead him to Laboon again. And together with him, everyone once again celebrated an incredible party. This time, one with music. However, during this last adventure, Luffy received a very grim reminder. His opponent, Gekko Moria, was someone who ultimately was weak. His zombie army posed a real threat through its number and strength, but Moria himself barely put up a fight, having become a shriveled corpse of his past self. Back in his day, he also used to be a pirate in search for the One Piece with his friends, but when he made it quite far, he encountered a roadblock, a Yonko. Much like Luffy's former opponent, Crocodile, Moria was crushed and defeated by one of the Yonko, growing weak, obese, and apathetic. He gave up on his strength and tried to cheat his way to the top by sacrificing others who would do the work for him. However, Luffy knew very well that he could not achieve his way to the pinnacle that way, because that would put those people in danger. He himself is made of rubber, he can bounce back, but if his friends are crushed, he might very well lose them altogether. Luffy knew that he was heading into the new world, that things would only get more dangerous, and he knew that he would one day have to face the same opponent that once crushed Moria. And so when Luffy reached the red line for a second time, marking the halfway point of his journey, he could only utter these grim words. "I'm glad we made it this far without losing anyone." However, as Luffy's crew made their way to the stunning Shibondi archipelago, it was the first time that Luffy finally realized the weight of what was coming ahead of him. Put in a dire situation, face to face with a powerful Shichibukai and his army of clones, as well as a Marine Admiral, all because Luffy wanted to help out a friend and stand against the Celestial Dragons just like Joy Boy would've. For the first time ever, Luffy found himself in what felt like a legitimately hopeless situation. Not because he didn't have a chance to survive himself, but because he had a chance to lose his friend. With no other options, Luffy declared to run away and to at all costs survive. But in front of his eyes, helpless and unable to do anything, Luffy lost his friends, one by one. His greatest fear came to pass, and at that moment, Luffy lost the most important thing in the world to him. More important than anything else, even his own dream, his friends. To Luffy, his friends are the most important thing in the world, because without friends, you can't throw a party. A party alone is sad and lonely, and so what's the point of throwing one if you have no friends? That's why Luffy wanted to recruit a large crew, make many friends, and throw the biggest party in the world, because to Luffy, parties are the embodiment of friendship. It's a moment where all social boundaries are thrown away, and people get to share their joy hand in hand. And so, when Luffy lost his entire crew, his greatest treasure, all he could think back to was them partying together. We see this sequence of the Straw Hats partying and singing together. It showed Luffy's love for his parties and how important they are. And yet now, he lost it all. Luffy finally understood how truly weak he was, and in that frustration, he too was sent away. However, fate would complicate things as Luffy would learn of a horrible truth, that his brother, Ace, after his loss to Teach, was set to be executed. Luffy found himself in an even bigger predicament and realized that he had to put his adventure on the back burner at the moment to focus on saving his brother's life. Luffy dived deep into the depths of hell in a desperate attempt to save his brother from this fate, creating miracles in order to survive, and yet he barely eluded him time and time again. Eventually, Luffy would end up on the great stage in the middle of the war between the Marines and one of the Yonko. But Ace was not just another random pirate. Sure, he had a decently impressive bounty, but it's definitely not something enough to bring the entire government to war. No, the stakes were far higher because the government believed that Ace would be the new Joy Boy. During his declaration of Ace's execution, Sengoku mentioned that if Ace is not to be stopped, then one day he would become the leader of a new generation of pirates who would make their way into the new world and change history. This new generation is exactly the same we would hear about much later in the Wano country, the one that Oden spoke about and we would later see make it to the pinnacle of the pirate world. But at this point in time, the government thought this person was Ace. After all, he was the son of the Pirate King, and in their eyes that seemed like an act of fate. Even Roger himself, like we mentioned, believed so, and even Whitebeard, according to Sengoku, wanted to make Ace the Pirate King. He wanted him to succeed Roger in that regard, so he too might have seen Ace as the potential new Joy Boy. That's why the government tried to kill Ace before he was born, and this is why they decided to execute Ace here, even if that meant going to war with a Yonko. The war was bloody. It was brutal, difficult, and cruel, but Luffy pushed through it all, and reached for Ace. His grandfather could not bear to stand in his way, and so Luffy was able to rescue Ace. But just as they were finally running away, in a moment of weakness, Luffy was distracted. And that is all it took. All it took was for Luffy to be weak for one moment, to lose Ace. His brother, the man whom he had shared a large part of his life with, who had been one of his very first friends, the very first person that he exchanged sake with, was fatally wounded. Around Luffy's arms, Ace shared his final words. He mentioned that just like the three of them had promised in their youth, he had fulfilled his objective, that he would live without regrets. However, there was one regret that he was left with, his final will, that he couldn't be there to see Luffy's own promise come to fruition, to accomplish what lied at the end of his dream. What Luffy had told him all that time ago, to throw the biggest party in the world. In disbelief, Luffy asked one simple thing. "You promised you wouldn't die! Isn't that what you told me, Ace?" And Ace simply replied, "Yeah." And in that way, Portgas the Ace passed away with a smile on his face, knowing that his will would live on, and that in that way, just like he had promised to Luffy, he wouldn't die. The Marines rejoiced in their victory, as did the government, thinking that at last the threat of Joy Boy of Roger's legacy had been wiped out from the world, that no one else would rise up to take his place. However, an unexpected guest showed up at Marineford, Blackbeard, the same man that Luffy had met all that time ago, the man who met on the crossroads of fate with Ace, resulting in his capture and execution. Unlike all those who had lost something in the war, he only ended up gaining. He attained a powerful crew of criminals from Impel Down, and even managed to steal Whitebeard's fruit, paving the path for his rise as one of the Yonko and potentially to become the Pirate King, sinking the world into darkness. At that moment, he probably declared that this was his era. Just as the threat of Joy Boy seemed to vanish, someone who would potentially change the world but to a far more dangerous extent seemed to arise and make its way to the pinnacle. However, Whitebeard simply told him these words.
ロジャーが待ってる男は少なくともティーチおめえじゃねえ。ロジャーの意志を継ぐ者たちがいるようにいずれエースの意志を継ぐ者も現れる。血縁を断てどあいつらの炎が消えることはねえ。そうやって遠い昔から脈々と受け継がれてきた。そして未来いつの日かその数百年分の歴史を全て背負ってこの世界に戦いを挑む者が現れる。戦国、おめえたち世界政府はいつか来る。その世界中を巻き込むほどの巨大な戦いを恐れている。興味はねえが あの宝を誰かが見つけたとき、世界はひっくり返るのさ。誰かが見つけ出す。その日は必ず来る。
And with his final words, Whitebeard laughed. He laughed, passing on with a smile on his face, opening the door to a new era, becoming the new gate to that era. Whitebeard understood his will would be inherited too, which in a sense was the will for Ace's own will and for Roger's will to both be inherited, because Whitebeard realized that what the government saw in Ace wasn't true, that Ace was not Joy Boy. He never was. From his first declaration all that time ago, Ace never said that he wanted to become a great man who would change the world or that he would find the One Piece. He simply was someone who wanted to give his life meaning, something he accomplished by the end of it. The real Joy Boy would be someone else, someone who would inherit Roger's will and Ace's will too. Because will goes beyond bloodlines. Will, much like the flames of the sun or the dawn, are carried like a torch, passed down as long as a bond of friendship is there. But while we know already what Roger's will was, what was Ace's will? What could his final dying wishes be that he could not accomplish? Well, on one hand, there's to an extent the promise Ace made with Otama and Yamato, but on the other, much more importantly and much more simply, Ace's will was his last regret, the one thing he had not been able to accomplish. To see Luffy accomplish his promise, to see Luffy throw the biggest party in the world. For as silly as it may sound, that is the will that Luffy inherited from Ace. Just like Marco said after Ace's death, Luffy's own life is Ace's living will, because Ace's final will was to see Luffy accomplish the goal at the end of his dream. As long as Luffy carried out his dream, he would be inheriting Ace's will. And for that reason, all of Luffy's friends and allies that he had gathered, something Mihawk deemed to be the most fearsome of powers, all put themselves at risk to ensure that he would live, so that Ace's own will would live on. Unfortunately, Luffy found himself in a dire situation yet again where he couldn't escape. Another member of the D clan appeared and offered him a way out, but it was too late. Luffy was about to be obliterated by an admiral, much like Ace, and yet someone stood in the way. A young marine all by himself put a stop to the war. But this person was no random marine. It was the first person Luffy ever befriended in his journey, someone who Luffy had saved from his misery and who managed to make it this far. It's through Luffy's own kindness that resulted in others saving him so many times that Luffy was able to live once again. And just as Shanks stated, as he appeared on the stage of this war, for the better of the worse, Kobe's own courage helped change the fate of the world. Luffy lived, and the Summit War came to an end. After such a painful struggle, Luffy had found himself broken. He didn't know what to do anymore. He realized he was simply too weak. If he couldn't even protect someone like Ace, then how could he become Pirate King? Moria had warned him, Luffy had realized it, yet he still stubbornly charged ahead. Luffy was too weak. But even though Luffy had lost many things, there was something he still had. And it was Jinbei, the man who would one day become one of his treasured crewmates, who showed Luffy what it is he still had. His friends, his crewmates, his nakama. Just like Ace had told Jinbei, Ace saw that Luffy was not the lonely guy who would chase after him anymore, but someone who had reliable friends to stand by his side who could make his dream come true. Luffy's own dream to throw the biggest party in the world, even in such an instance of despair, was still possible. His friends were still there to celebrate it with him, and it's at this point that Luffy, by deciding to chase after this dream once again alongside his friends, inherited Ace's dream, his will, which quite simply was his own. So while Ace's dream was the same as Joy Boy's, it wasn't because Ace was Joy Boy, but because he wanted to see the new Joy Boy accomplish his dream. And that's exactly what Luffy would vow to do. But Luffy realized that he was still too weak. This experience was enough to teach him that if he continued to be reckless, he really would lose more people. So, to ensure that he would keep all his friends alive and be able to party with them at the ends of the world, all he had to do was to get stronger. Luffy made the choice to train, to become stronger, and to work hard enough to get to a point where he could really make his dream come true, where he really could throw the biggest party in the world. After 2 years of training, newly acquired strength, and about to inherit Ace's will, Monkey D. Luffy, on his quest to become the new Joy Boy, or as he saw it, the Pirate King, finally started his journey to go to the New World, reuniting with his friends and heading to the underwater paradise, Fishman Island. However, Luffy did not realize that there he would face one of his toughest challenges, not a challenge of fighting against a strong enemy, but as against a societal curse. As we've talked before, Fishman had to flee from the surface. After all, with Joy Boy's dream of the dawn jeopardized, their hopes for equality were lost and squandered. For centuries they sought refuge at the bottom of the ocean, and yet they all knew deep in their hearts that they longed for the real sun. And this is something that no one understood better than Queen Otohime. Otohime, a political activist who became the queen of the kingdom thanks to her height and haki, understood better than anyone the struggles of her people, that the fishmen desired to reach for the sun. And so began a long campaign to convince her people to not be afraid of humans, to break those barriers between them and to live under the same sun. After all, like Neptune said, Otohime's own dream was the same dream as her ancestors, the desire to live under the same sun. At the same time, there was also an important major figure in the history of Fishman Island, Fisher Tiger. Fisher Tiger also wished for Otohime's ideals, but in a different way. Unlike Otohime, the hatred in his heart was too deep. After all, Fisher Tiger had been a slave to the Celestial Dragons. He had seen the absolute wars that humans had to offer. The hatred of the Celestial Dragons was so powerful that it completely overshadowed Fisher Tiger's own hopes of uniting the world together under the same sun. He knew Otohime was right, but the sun in his heart, darkened by his prejudice for humans, refused their blood to save his life. And yet he understood just how wrong this was. His only wish was for his hatred to die there, to let him consume all of it, begging his crewmates to not let his hatred reach the people of Fishman Island. And as his crewmates accepted to carry that vow, Fisher Tiger smiled, knowing how his will would be inherited and that he would not die. Sadly, not all would accept to inherit this will. His crewmate Arlong misunderstood his message and continued to carry on that hatred with him, causing much damage to humans, resulting in them fearing Fishman in turn. But someone would come to stop Arlong from sullying that dream and putting an end to Fisher Tiger's hatred, someone who would unknowingly inherit Fisher Tiger's will. But while Otohime struggled to make that dream come true, when she witnessed her daughter awaken the power of Poseidon, she realized that the world would soon begin to change. Poseidon's apparition meant that Joy Boy would soon appear too, so Otohime realized this was the time for change, to build a better future for the children of this world. However, one day, without warning, Otohime was shot. In the middle of the plaza in broad daylight, Otohime lost her life. Her son became filled with anger, swearing to avenge her, and yet Otohime asked him to not be angry, asking him and the rest of her children to not let that will become uninherited, to be replaced with anger and darkness, to instead embrace her will and build a bridge towards a better tomorrow. Fukaboshi thus vowed that he would keep collecting those signatures, that they would ensure Otohime's dream would come to pass, and that they would inherit her will. And having said that, Otohime laughed and passed away with a smile on her face. And so, 10 years into the future, just like Otohime foretold, someone would appear to guide Shirahoshi. They would save Fishman Island from sinking in its hatred and would bring destruction to the darkness that enveloped it, much like they would one day bring the destruction of the world. Despite many attempts to raise Otohime's will and to destroy Fishman Island by the hands of Hody Jones, Luffy appeared to guide Shirahoshi and fought for the sake of saving not just his crewmates, but even all fishmen. The Ark Noah came close to being destroyed, but was preserved just in time through Poseidon's powers, whom Luffy was able to guide, saving all the people of Fishman Island. They might look physically different than him, but in the end that has never mattered to Luffy, because to him, they're friends. And no scene could depict this better than the path to the sun, where Luffy on the brink of death is saved by Jinbe, who unlike Fisher Tiger, is not afraid to transfer his blood. He does what Fisher Tiger wishes he could have achieved, helping connect humans and fishmen through something as simple as a plastic tube. But all could see it for what it was, a path to the sun, a path to friendship a path to Nakama.
俺の仲間になれよ。
Despite his claims of not being a hero, Luffy really was starting to become one. The reason Luffy hates being considered a hero is because he doesn't want to be seen as greater or above other people. He doesn't want to rule over them like a god like others want to. He doesn't want to control others, but simply to be their equal, their friend. And in that regard, while Luffy has kept developing as an excellent leader and even became someone worthy of being called a hero, in the end he's never been about the fame or the recognition, but about being able to protect others so he can befriend them, to ensure that he never has to be alone again, and to be able to share the joys of life by partying side by side with them, something he does by the end, throwing a massive party that connects humans and fishmen alike. Perhaps more than anything, that's what makes Luffy the Joy Boy. After being carried by some kind whales, Luffy's first stop in the New World ended up being the island of Punk Hazard. There he met several different individuals, including a marine who had been pursuing him for a long while, a mysterious samurai from a far-off land, and the man who had saved him and Marineford, the member of the D clan, Trafalgar D. Waterlaw. There, Law offered Luffy the option to team up to open the road towards taking one of the Yonko, Kaido. After his hard training for 2 years, Luffy was finally willing to start heading towards this insurmountable pinnacle that so many had warned him about. But his other meetings on this island were equally as important. The samurai he met was none other than Kinemon, one of the vassals of Kosuke Oden, who had inherited Oden's will to accomplish his dream of opening the borders of the Wano country. And it would be Kinemon, as well as Momonosuke, that would serve as the guiding light towards Wano to lead Luffy on the path of inheriting Oden's will and helping open the borders of the Wano country. But another meeting that might be easy to overlook is Luffy's meeting with Smoker, because while at first glance it might not seem important, it's a particular scene that takes place at the very end of the arc that once again shows Luffy's ability to connect with people. Because while Smoker has attempted to chase after Luffy to capture him all this time, at the end all Luffy ends up doing with him is partying. The two of them, alongside all the Marines, party together, bringing pirates and Marines together hand in hand, uniting them as one, showing that no matter who you are, no matter your allegiance, we are all people who are capable of partying together. With this, Luffy's first steps to take down the Yonko start to fall into place, and the first order of action was to destroy the factory of artificial dao fruits on the island of Dressrosa, the island of passion, love, and toys. Ole! And it's particularly this plotline of artificial dao fruits that seems so minor at first, but it becomes quickly apparent how significant it is to the story at large when you realize that the artificial dao fruits are called smiles. But this naming choice is both a lot more grim and a lot more thematically relevant than it might first seem, because the reason for this naming derives from the fact that these smiles, in the case of failure, which is a whooping rate of 90%, result in permanent laughter. Those cursed by these smiles end up with smiles and laughter on their face that they cannot remove. But these aren't real smiles, they're not real joy, real laughter. These don't come from genuine joy, but from SAD, and could never compare to real laughter, to real joy. And who is that orchestrated this entire operation of smiles? Don Quixote do Flamingo. And what is the Flamingo's most defining trait? Doflamingo always uncontrollably laughs. Maniacally and creepily, but he always laughs. Not because he has eaten a smile fruit, he hasn't, but as a trait of who he is. This wasn't always the case. In his flashback when Doflamingo was a celestial dragon, he never once laughed or smiled. And yet, after his horrible past, we see his demeanor having completely changed, becoming a force of evil that never stops laughing. Always laughing and smiling, doing so even when a situation is dire. Even in his Jolly Roger, a massive laugh is featured, and he always stated that a new era of smiles and laughter was coming with an unstoppable swell, though perhaps not quite in the way he meant it. I feel that in a sense, at least thematically, Doflamingo, who was born as a celestial dragon, fell from grace and became someone just like the members of the D clan. Someone who sought the destruction of the world and who became the natural enemy of the celestial dragons. Ironically enough, Doflamingo has a D initial in his name, 2 of them in fact, but he lacks the real D initial. In that regard, the parallel couldn't be more clear in how he is like a D in everything but name. If the D are considered the natural enemies of the gods, seen almost as if they were devils, then Doflamingo's epithet, the Heavenly Demon, couldn't be more fitting because he's a demon who wants to become a god. But Doflamingo, unlike many members of the D clan, is someone who doesn't laugh out of joy. He laughs out of madness. Much like someone like Shebek or Blackbeard, Doflamingo laughs out of madness because his goal is not the destruction of the world to make it be born anew, but to destroy the world as revenge against the celestial dragons. Doflamingo didn't want to put a stop to the celestial dragons for noble ambitions. He has no desires of bringing the world under a unified dawn, but rather he wanted the power of the celestial dragons for himself. He wanted to rule from the pinnacle, to become the king of the world, much like the one who really became the king of the world. The parallels between Doflamingo and King Emu could not be more evident. And in that regard, Doflamingo turned Dressrosa in a miniature replica of the world, playing at being its king. A society where only those who are willing to be subservient get to stay, and all those who refuse are forgotten. Because Doflamingo understood very well that the worst fate one could suffer was to be forgotten, and so he ensured that, through Sugar's powers, all of his enemies would end up being forgotten. This not only erases people from history, but even erases any inherited will. He ended up doing exactly what the world government did. The people of Dressrosa could tell something was wrong, and yet they all turned their eyes away. Those who were privileged enough to remain didn't bother to help save those who had been casted away, living under Doflamingo's metaphorical birdcage, which divided and controlled the people of the island, robbing them all of their freedom and treating them like nothing more than marionettes. But as long as someone was able to remember and willing to inherit that will, these things will never cease to be. And someone wanted to oppose Doflamingo's wish. His younger brother, Rocinante, someone who knew as a former celestial dragon himself better than anyone that the D would one day challenge the gods and change the world. And yet at the same time he knew that Doflamingo wanted to do the same, but in doing so will likely bring the world to its ruin. As we mentioned, Doflamingo is the antithesis of someone like Luffy, someone who is pining for the same goal, like Monet said, to become the Pirate King, but wants to do so only to take the place of the gods as God himself, a heavenly demon who could rule from the heavens. Rocinante wanted to make sure that Law would stay away from Doflamingo, though his love for Law was certainly not just for the sake of that purpose, for he understood the pain Law was suffering. And so he put everything on the line for the sake of saving him, but realizing this would cost him his life, Rocinante only could do one thing. He smiled. He smiled and said, "You'll remember me even after I'm dead, won't you? So I'll die with a smile on my face." Corazon, the man who gave Law his heart and pulled him out of the madness the world government had sunk him into, died with a smile on his face, because he knew that he would not die and that his will would be inherited. His will being for someone to stop Doflamingo, as well as for Law to live his life freely. And so many years later, Law came back to Dressrosa to carry out Corazon's will to defeat Doflamingo, joined by Luffy, who helped him inherit that will. At many points, Luffy nearly lost his life, but he was saved time and time again, including by Sabo, who had lived, survived, and come back to inherit Ace's will. Up until that point, that's something that he couldn't have done because he had forgotten Ace, and having forgotten him, he couldn't inherit that will. But when regaining his memories after Ace's death, he was able to inherit his will, the will to protect their little brother, Luffy, and to let him reach the goal at the end of his dream, that party he sought to create. At the same time, Luffy's struggles inspire the hearts of the people of Dressrosa, finally connecting everyone together against Doflamingo, and together, hand in hand, everyone decided to push against this fate. By each of them pushing against the strings, everyone pushed to break free from this birdcage Doflamingo had trapped them in, and thanks to their help, Luffy reached the climax of his fight. Suffocated by Doflamingo's desire to keep everyone trapped and divided within this birdcage, Luffy struck him down and sent this false god falling from the heavens into the earth below, bringing destruction to Dressrosa, but in turn freeing it, much like he would one day do for the rest of the world. With this adventure complete, Luffy set out on his next one, but before that, 7 powerful warriors who were all saved by Luffy and his friends and who fought with him side by side during the Battle of Dressrosa decided to join Luffy by forming the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, offering to exchange sake cups with him. But Luffy refused to drink that sake. But why? Wasn't Luffy the one who always wanted to share sake with others and party with them to show their bonds of friendship? Well, yes, but it's exactly because he wants to do it that way that he refused to do so here. As Luffy explained, he doesn't want to be the boss of a big fleet. He doesn't want to be a big shot. He doesn't want to be seen as a hero. He just wants to be the pirate king, to be free, and to share that freedom with others. And so instead of sharing sake cups in a formal ceremony to make them his subordinates, Luffy shared sake with them in a far more natural way, by throwing a massive party where they could exchange sake to forge bonds of friendship. People from all types of races, humans, long arms, long legs, giants, dwarves, all partying side by side, connected as one. Together, all these people would one day cause a massive incident of historic proportions, but that is a story that none yet know about. Luffy's journey continued, making it to the mysterious island of Zou. There he reunited with his friends, preparing to make his move for the Wano country and setting his sights on the road poneglyphs. However, at the same time, he also found out that Sanji disappeared, abducted by his blood relatives to be married off to the family of the Yonko Big Mom. And thus, Luffy made his way deep into Big Mom's territory, alongside some of his crewmates, a mink by the name of Pedro, and a certain rabid mink, who might or might not become Luffy's future crewmate. Honestly, this has absolutely nothing to do with this theory, it's just that I really want her to join the crew. Please, Oda! But yes, after going through quite a few struggles, Luffy finally rejoined with Sanji and asked him to come back. But even after Sanji lashed out at Luffy, Luffy saw through his lies and loudly declared that without Sanji, he won't become Pirate King. Or rather, he can't become Pirate King. Because without his cook, how could he throw the world's biggest party? Because without his friend, he can't throw the world's biggest party. If all his friends aren't there, then that party can't happen. Luffy waited and waited, believing in Sanji, but after many struggles, he finally reunited with him. And when that happened, when Sanji finally said how he wants to go back with everyone, Luffy finally smiled again. That said, Luffy's escape from Whole Cake Island would not prove easy. They would face the Yonko Big Mom, who, similarly to Luffy, has an ideal of uniting all the races together. However, this is done from a personal motivation. Big Mom wants to unite races to fulfill her ideals, not for the sake of others or for the sake of freedom. She still acts as a ruling tyrant and robs others of their freedom, allowing none to leave her country. In the end, she really isn't better than many other tyrants, and so Luffy vowed to one day defeat her. But there is perhaps no other more influential figure in the story of Whole Cake Island than Pedro. Pedro, who wanted to infiltrate Whole Cake Island to finally get that road poneglyph, realizing that his master saw in Luffy what they saw in Roger, the potential to become the new Joy Boy, put everything on the line in order to pave a path for Luffy, or rather, a path for the Dawn. Pedro was technically the first to explain to us what the Dawn is, as he understood how important it was for it to come to pass, for both the freedom of his people and for the sake of the freedom of the world. And so, just like Roger told him, he realized he would have to wait until his turn, and help play a part in paving the path to the Dawn, much like many others already had. And stuck in a situation they had no hope of overcoming, Pedro realized that his turn had finally come. With barely much lifespan left in him, Pedro embraced his role and gave his life for the Dawn. Lighting his dynamite and bidding his final farewell, Pedro smiled. Pedro knew he wouldn't be forgotten. He knew his will would be inherited and the dawn of the world would come to pass. That one day, all the people of the world could finally be united under the same sun. His will would be inherited by both Carrot, who would inherit his wishes and help the Straw Hats bring the dawn, and of course, Luffy, who will one day make the dawn come to pass. As such, the departure from Whole Cake Island, for the first time in ages, did not end in a party. It didn't end in a cheerful party, for it was a bittersweet ending. As Oda said, he doesn't like killing off characters because he feels that would ruin the mood of a party. So in this one occasion, a party is forfeited. But with Sanji back on the crew, Luffy would be reassured that the cook for his party would always be there. At last, we've made it! Here begins the great play of Wano. As turbulent events developed in the outside world, laying the seeds for the events that would lead to the war that would split the seas, Luffy and his friends finally made their way to the land of Wano, ready to face the great Yonko Kaido. Upon his arrival there, Luffy met a young girl by the name of Otama. But this was no ordinary girl, but someone who a long time ago had made a promise with Ace. A promise to free the country from Kaido's rule, something Ace could not accomplish. And as such, Luffy decided to inherit his will, and decided to carry out Ace's promise in his place. He ended up being defeated, but like the robber he is, he bounced back and trained hard to make sure he could stand up to Kaido. Meanwhile, his crewmates met the people of Ebisu Town, as well as an exacting man by the name of Yasuye. This town was cursed by the power of smiles, forced to laugh by the artificial Dal fruits. Annoyed by the cries of the people he was marginalizing, the corrupt shogun fed them smiles so that they would keep laughing, unable to show their tears, forcing joy upon them rather than delivering it in a natural way. But Yasuye brought about a change. Instead of making the citizens laugh out of biological reaction, he taught them to laugh for real. To not let their emotions be controlled by this biological impulse, but to smile and laugh from their own heart. To take a positive outlook on life and to be willing to laugh even in the face of hardship. An ideal that was long since shared by Joy Boy's people. And this is all due to the fact that Yasuye himself never ate a smile. And so those smiles, those laughs, were all his own. And down to his final moments when he was shot and executed, Yasuye died with a smile on his face, because he knew he wouldn't be forgotten and that his will would be inherited. The same held true for Kosuke Oden, who was executed on that spot many years ago. He knew that his vassals would remember him, so he did not care if others forgot him. So with his final words, he passed on with a smile on his face, knowing his will would be inherited, as did his wife Toki, telling Oden to shine his own moonlight over his scabbards so they could one day help bring the brilliance of the dawn. All of these wills would be inherited by Oden's vassals and in turn by Luffy himself. Luffy and his allies set sail for Onigashima, ready to finally declare battle on Kaido and his men. But it's on this island that Luffy would meet a very important figure. Suddenly before him appeared a tall figure. This was Yamato, who would turn out to be someone who possessed incredible knowledge, being the only one who had access to Oden's logbook, and thus access to many of the secrets in the world. From this book, Yamato learned about fate and inherited will, and how a new Joy Boy would one day be born, appear, and come to Wano. Perhaps this might be why Yamato believed to have become a new Oden, having taken this idea of a new Joy Boy too literally. But more importantly, Yamato had also met Ace and made a promise with him, with Ace deciding to one day meet again and help free Yamato from this island. Much like with Otama, Luffy once again inherited this promise of Ace. Through inheriting Ace's flames and delivering a powerful red rock to Kaido, Luffy declared to him and Big Mom that he would surpass them, just as Roger foretold. However, it's Yamato's meeting with Ace that illustrates to us something very important. As the two of them exchanged sake under the moon, Ace told Yamato that Luffy would become the one to lead this new generation, just as we have already mentioned. And caught in the parting, Ace accidentally revealed Luffy's true dream: to throw the world's biggest party. And it's precisely at that moment that Yamato realized this was the same thing the Pirate King had also once said. Yamato realized that much like Roger, Luffy desires to throw the biggest party in the world and to exchange sake with people from all over. It's this realization that made Yamato decide to wait for the day that Luffy would arrive. And so in that time, Yamato has been waiting and brewing sake to one day exchange it with Luffy. Just like Yamato stated in the complete title for chapter 1000, this is what Yamato has been holding on to all this time. The sake I brewed while waiting for you, Straw Hat Luffy. That brings us to the present, but our story doesn't end here. We need to go all the way up to the end. However, it's hard to really say what will happen, since at this point we can only speculate what is going to happen. Regardless, I don't think it matters much, since it's impossible to predict the more specific details, only the broader strokes. But none of the specifics really matter to us. What only really matters to us here is the context of the One Piece itself. So let's just focus on understanding the major points of what is going to come ahead. Put simply, once Wano ends, the final saga will begin. Oda has already alluded as such himself in the SBS. But the final saga itself will likely be comprised by several different arcs, short and long. I think a setup arc will likely be the final destination the Straw Hats really must visit before making their way to the final island, being the Islands of Giants, Elbaf. Given its potential ties with the Great Kingdom, it's quite likely that that might have a poneglyph or two, perhaps even a road poneglyph for some reason. Elbaf could perhaps also be a good opportunity to defeat Big Mom if she doesn't get defeated at Wano, but either way, I think eventually soon enough, all 4 poneglyphs will fall into the hands of the Straw Hats. In that regard, the location of Laugh Tale will finally be revealed to the Straw Hats, but where exactly will that be? Well, many have speculated where it could be. Some think it will be on the moon, or some believe more logically that it will be under Reverse Mountain, which makes a lot of sense, but personally, there's a certain line of dialogue that always stood out to me. In chapter 820, Inuarashi explained that the final island at the ends of the Grand Line, Lodestar, would explain how to seek out the 4 road poneglyphs. This name holds particular relevance given how Roger was born at Lockdown, which is located on the Polestar archipelago. Lodestar and Polestar. Nami, however, argued that Crocus mentioned the final island of the Grand Line was in Lodestar but Laugh Tale, and Inuarashi replied, well, Crocus was a crewmate of the Pirate King, one of those who knows everything. He would not lie about that unless he disliked you. So what if Crocus meant that Laugh Tale was at Lodestar, but perhaps hidden away? Maybe it's a sky island above Lodestar, or maybe it's under the water, or something is needed to access it, or maybe I'm just misunderstanding this line, but it doesn't really matter where Laugh Tale is, it only matters that the Straw Hats will get there. However, attaining the One Piece will not be easy. As both characters in World and even Oda himself stated, a massive war will erupt. Everything that has been set up all across the timeskip will come into play. Vegapunk will appear, and with him, the origin of Dow Fruits will be explained. The events set up across the Reverie will come into play, and everything is going to fall together for a struggle to attain the One Piece. The world government, and specifically King Emu, will make their move, threatening to sink the world into shadows, purging its light, purging its sun. It's been emphasized that the world government has been gathering a lot of weapons. They were desperate enough that they went directly to Orochi to ask, and one of Orochi's men even suggested that they were preparing to start a massive war. In that regard, Emu might be done with just letting the status quo remain and might try to take things into his own hands. We've seen this more recently with how the world government has decided not to try to erase the existence of the ancient weapons, but to seize them for themselves. However, unavoidably, the Revolutionary Army will try to stand as a force against Emu, and Dragon will likely or hopefully play a big role. His own ability to create storms will result in a literal storm being brought, just like celestial dragons always believed the D would. At the same time, Blackbeard will also finally make his move to attempt to seize the position of Pirate King for himself. He will rise up as Luffy's final challenge to attain the One Piece. The man who he had met all that time ago, who much like Luffy, rose from the shadows to become one of the most known figures in the world, the other side to his coin, will finally challenge him to determine who will make it to the pinnacle. Someone who, much like Luffy, laughs and loves to party, but he monopolizes that party and only shows favor to those who are willing to follow him. All others who won't will sink in his darkness, because that is what reaching for the pinnacle means to him. I legitimately believe that even with figures like Emu, Blackbeard has, and always will be, Luffy's central antagonistic force he will have to face as his ultimate struggle. A member of the D-Clan, a member of the worst generation, which makes him a candidate for Pirate King as Morgan's mentioned, who could potentially become the Pirate King. Whether it's him or Luffy who will make it to the pinnacle is not yet set in stone, but just like we have believed in him all this time, we must keep believing in Luffy until the very end. But this war is going to bring back far more than just few characters. Everyone will be here, everyone we've met so far in our journey will come back for this incredible finale. Well, I mean, not everyone, but at least a large part of all the major characters in the story. Enel will finally make his way down from the moon. Moria might ally himself with Blackbeard. Crocodile will make his move. Hancock might come to help Luffy. Mihawk will be present to have a final duel with Zoro. Buggy will be up to some shenanigans. Many of the Marines we've met so far will be there. Many of the Shichibukai we've met will be there too. The Grand Fleet will finally come into action and play out the major role they were foreshadowed to one day play, helping Luffy achieve his struggle to become Pirate King. Who knows, maybe even Foxy will return or something. Basically, think something like Stampede, but on an actual larger scale, with even more characters and a far larger scope, especially from a narrative perspective. This final saga will both be filled with very-worthy reveals and with unbelievable stakes in this grand war. Just like Oda stated, the final saga will make Marineford look cute by comparison. Everyone will be there, and the reason for that is much more than just for the sake of throwbacks and to make a cool final saga, because think about it. If everyone is there, it will finally become possible. With everyone in the world gathered in one place, at last it can become a reality. The biggest party in the world. The fight will not be easy, it will prove to be the greatest struggle Luffy and his allies have ever faced. But if Luffy can succeed, then he will finally be able to do it. He will finally defeat the world government and put an end to the corruption of the celestial dragons. He will defeat Blackbeard and change the world, and turning it upside down, bringing it out of its night and into the dawn, the Ramon's dawn. He will guide the ancient weapons to destroy the world, to break down the walls that divided people apart, and uniting everyone together, both literally by uniting the seas and by connecting people together. He will bring the sea folk from the floor to the surface and ensure that everyone can live under the same sun. But this alone would not be enough to bring everyone together. Even if the barriers of the world were to be destroyed, this alone would not be enough to heal the wounds of the world and bring joy to everyone in the world. Something will be needed to bring that joy, which would finally make Luffy become the new Joy Boy. Just like so many believed one day would come to pass, someone would arise, challenge the world to a fight, and turn it upside down. Someone who would make it to the ends of the seas, destroy the world, and find a treasure lying at the very end of their journey. And as Straw Hat Luffy, the man who turned the world upside down and brought the Ramon's dawn, stood in front of the One Piece, finally laying eyes on the treasure he searched for. After all this time in his long journey, he finally realized everything in this world. And much like everyone who came before him, much like all those who could not make it this far, but knew that their dreams would all one day come to pass, Luffy quite simply laughed.
そう、自分の目で確かめるがよい。人々は今誰一人戦いなど望んではいない。
This joyous boy helped connect all those who had been divided for so many centuries through the simple act of throwing a massive party. A party where everyone could throw away hatred and discrimination and instead indulge in joy and laughter. And it is this massive party that would not only connect all people together as equals, but it is also this massive party that would allow everyone to finally laugh together. The people of the world had endured everything in order to laugh again. With the One Piece in his hands, Luffy could finally bring laughter to the entire world. He would be able to finally make his dream a reality and throw the biggest party in the world, connecting all the people from all the seas under the same sun together as one. That is how One Piece will end. But that is a story no one yet knows about. But with all said and done, what is the One Piece? How do all these scenes foreshadow it? Well, the definitive answer will lie in the final episode, the culmination of this long series of videos, where we will finally answer the greatest question in this entire series. Episode 8 of the True History what is the One Piece?